The scent of rosemary and garlic hung so thick in the room it felt like a wall I could lean against. The chandeliers threw a gold net over linen and laughter. Men in jackets that had never known a washing machine argued about vineyards. Women touched wine glasses the way people touch rare things, delicate and possessive. I had been ferrying plates between myth and reality for 5 years at Bellanova, learning to be invisible where people paid to be seen. My shoes were scuffed. My apron had a stubborn coffee stain by the hip. I liked to say those things out loud sometimes, the way a person reminds themselves of a shape that keeps them grounded. I am not one of them. Table 7 was a pocket of quiet in the roar. He sat alone. No phone, no indecent display of power. He had an old-fashioned posture, like someone who had read books in his youth and been disciplined by the practice. His hands, as they rested on the table, were long and careful. The cuff of his jacket was plain, not ostentatious. He smelled faintly of cedar and something citrusy I couldn't name. His eyes lifted to me when I set the plate down. For a second, the world's edges sharpened his face, a plane of assessment, and something else. Something private enough to be dangerous. "One braised short rib," I said. "Medium." He smiled without moving his lips much. It was a small, contained thing. "Thank you," he murmured. On nights like that, I listened to a lot of quiet things. My father taught me to watch hands. He never allowed me to forget that an honest hand tells a story you can trust more than a tongue. James Hart earned his living reading hands, faces, schuster kind of things. Polite people pretended not to notice. He taught me how to stand in a doorway and let a room tell me what it was thinking. I carried those lessons like a talisman. They kept me alive once. They were about to save a stranger and change everything. I had just turned my shoulder to leave when someone breathed right behind me, a sound so soft I almost thought the room itself had whispered, "Run." It was not the room. The breath touched the back of my neck like a cool fingertip. The word was low and urgent, and there was no owner in sight, no one near enough to be a conspirator, no hand on my arm, no face in my periphery. The syllable slid into me the way a splinter can, tiny and undeniable. My first thought was to call out, to ask who had said it. My second thought was of my father's voice. "Watch the hands." My body obeyed the second before either of the other two, the reflex of a life threaded with small, practical survivals. I moved a fraction of an inch to the left. The tray tipped. It didn't fall gracefully. Wine slashed across the white tablecloth of table 7, a wet, red comet arcing toward the stranger's lap. Glass hit floor. The kind of noise you never expect in a place that sells calm clings. A high, taut cracking. The room leapt, people moving as if the floor had broken under them. Someone screamed. Time dilated to camera film. A shot followed, bright and animal, like a snapped wire. It ripped through the chandelier above table 7. Crystal broke into a dozen needles that spattered light across the room. Screams turned to chaos. I remember the hot, metallic scent of something bullet. As if someone had cut a piece of the air away, I hit the man's arm. I pushed. My heels caught on tile. I saw his profile twist with surprise. A flash of something that might have been gratitude, might have been calculation. We dropped behind the overturned wine cart and into the thicket of everybody's fear. Afterwards, every survivor swears the sequence slows into a string of particulars. I remember the heat of the man's shoulder against my cheek as we flattened beneath varnished oak. I remember the sound of glass grinding underfoot as 2 men scrambled toward the kitchen, and I remember the whisper again. Impossibly, run, like an incantation, like a map. I don't know who said it. I never learned. I only knew I had not been moving for show. I had been moving because a single syllable threaded through the din and told me which way the world would bend. They herded us out the service door. Someone had called for ambulances that weren't yet there. Someone else was pressing the manager's face into the floor. The street was wet with spilt wine and rain, and a city that had been pretending it didn't notice until it had to. A black SUV idled at the curb like a promise. A man with a jaw softened by sleep or anger, Marco, opened the back and pulled me in before I could say no. The drive was a blur of light and wet glass, and the way your heart does the arithmetic of survival. I could be hurt, or who I loved could be hurt, or I could be used as someone else's shield. The SUV smelled of upholstery and lemon. It smelled of someone else's life. There was a hand on my shoulder that was neither rough nor kind, just firm, with a kind of business. A radio murmured details I couldn't make out. Marco kept driving. Silence. Then a leaden, total quiet. We popped into a building I had seen photographed in magazines. The outside was all glass and steel and ice, palace, but the elevator that took us up had that human, guarded pulse. A keypad that muttered, a gate that hummed. The doors opened to a space that was less a house than a curated argument with the Skyliner balanced on pedestals. An entire wall that seemed to be made of night. A woman's voice, Elena, moved softly through the rooms as if she could tidy fear itself. And she had a way of setting out mugs, so they sat in neat, trusting rows. They called the apartment a safe house, but it was cleaner than any house I'd ever lived in. It had a sofa that swallowed my legs, and a rug that held my feet like a promise. The man from table 7 was given a blanket that looked almost ridiculous against his tailored jacket. He let the blanket fall like a curtain, and stared at me, not with accusation but with a curiosity that was distinctly unmercenary. Lucia Hart, he said later, when the quiet thickened into conversation, and he felt like someone who collected truths. You have steady hands. You don't know me, I said. He shrugged. You saved me. The room smelled of coffee and something like the inside of an old book. Giovanni circled through, a large man with a belt of tools and eyes like someone who had learned the local dangers and retired from sweat to thought. He had the look of anyone who spends too much time proving that things will not be taken from him again. Why me? I asked. Why not call the police? Marco bristled like a wire. You called the police, he said. And it was the clipped sound of someone who had rehearsed answers. Chaos. Cameras. Movement. It draws more than it helps. I thought of my father for a long time in that moment, James Hart, who had always said the badge was a practical thing, not a moral pedestal. He had taught me to trust law, but also to see that law sometimes moved like winter ice, dependable, but slow. He had also taught me a harsher lesson. Power could show you mercy, and then take a piece of you as payment. Who are you? I asked the man from table 7 more directly. If you don't mind me asking. He smiled, and the smile was a thing that didn't want to be pinned down. Raphael Bellori, he said. My family runs hospitality, logistics, investments. We are investment heavy. That choice of words was wary. A carpenter who didn't want to show the crack in the wood. He didn't say the words gangster or boss. He didn't have to. Names in the papers arrive with labels attached. But in person, a name is a resource and a shield. Raphael was careful with both. His hand stayed still on the blanket in his lap, and every now and then he would look at me as if he was measuring the distance between my knuckles and the seam of my apron. You don't look like a client, he said, almost embarrassed by the observation. I don't look like I'm meant to be invisible, I said. That's the point. He laughed, small and surprised. You moved like someone who'd been trained. My father taught me to watch, I said, and then I said the thing that cuts both ways. My father is dead. His face changed at the 2 words. Something in him recoiled like a hand from heat. I thought he would offer the ritual condolence, but he did not. Instead, a shadow crossed his features, and he nodded with a slow, intimate sympathy. James Hart, he said. I knew him. He was a good man. You did? He touched his chest like someone acknowledging a debt. He once did a favor that cost him. He never asked for repayment. The apartment felt smaller after that. My father existed in their world too, not as a ghost told to me by memory, but as a ledger entry. A misstep counted, a kindness owed. It made the city feel tangled in ways my high school civics class had never prepared me for. When he told me about the hit, Raphael's voice did something like lowering the light. There was a date, he said, a name. They bought a pattern of men that suggested professionals were involved. He used the word professionals with the weight of someone who had been held under a curtain and watched the smoke. Dmitry Klov is expanding. He brings people who don't care about collateral. He's not interested in negotiation. When Raphael said Dmitry Klov, I heard a name and a rumble behind it, a distant train loaded with intentions. He might have been an oligarch in another life, or an abstract threat in a newspaper piece. Here, his name had teeth. I resisted the urge to ask how much. It felt like asking a widow how much the funeral had cost. Why, tell me any of this, I asked. I was just doing my job. Because you might have been the only person in that room who could have seen what was coming, Raphael said. He smiled again, but this time, it was an apologetic thing. And because someone whispered run to you. Not many people get a warning like that. It was odd. He did not seem to blame me for causing the spill. He did not blame me for saving him. He treated both things like shreds of human choreography, and when all the chairs get pushed around, you pick the ones you can still sit in. Who whispered? I asked. He frowned. I don't know. Someone was warning us, Marco said. Flat. Giovanni, who had been standing by a window with his hands in his pockets, looked at me as if assessing a puzzle. Could be sympathetic patron, he said. Could be our people. Could be someone trying to make a mess of it. It was a startlingly small array of possible explanations for a violent event. I wanted neat answers, a phone call that printed a solution on a screen, but life was always more cloth than blueprint. Raphael's expression when he said it was what lingered. A man who'd been trained to expect treachery, but still taken aback when fate wore a human face. I think the thing that unsettled me most was that I had been a small character in two lives at once. To the patrons at Bellanova, I was background, a moving utensil. To Raphael's people, I was an anomaly, an unplanned variable. To myself, I was all the things my father had taught me, and none of the names the papers used. When I thought about where I belonged, the answer was nowhere in particular. It made the prospect of being moved to a safe house more than a convenience. It felt like being folded into someone else's book and asked to play a part. They offered me coffee. I stared at my mug like it might substantiate the whole mess. Elena had them all moving, a measure, more like a theater company than like an armed household. She smoothed the blanket on Raphael's lap like someone who calmed pain with linens. She set 2 cups down in front of me as if I were a woman she knew and liked. Will you call the police? I asked again, because part of me wanted the world to obey a covenant. Raphael's jaw tightened. If the police get involved, Dimitri's people will know about it in an hour. Blanket draws attention. He didn't say that a police hunt can sometimes be its own weapon. He didn't need to. His voice was careful. I have other ways to fix a problem. What ways? I pressed. I grew up believing there was one way. He considered me. That patient, honest look again. You grew up with a badge, he said. I grew up with a ledger. He touched the edge of the blanket between us like someone counting the pages of a book. Both can be tools. Both can be weapons. I prefer to use what's necessary and leave the rest standing. There it was, his secret, or the first of them. A moral architecture that tolerated hard choices but insisted on boundaries. He was, in his own way, pragmatic. He had a code. It wasn't saintly. It wasn't clean. It looked more like a reluctant surgeon's scalpel, choosing incisions with the economy of someone who knows what's at stake. How is that a secret? I asked. It sounds like business sense. He gave me a look, like a man who had been carved out by experience. Because most people in my line of work assume the sharpest tool is the sharpest answer. They don't bother with negotiation. They don't save collateral. They consider mercy a weakness. He smiled again, wry and private. I keep windows open. I spend more time than people expect at the bargaining table. I'd like to take that at face value, I said. Because it wasn't my place to be either saint or prosecutor. In my chest the old knot of allegiance my father had tied, tightened and loosened like someone testing a line. Later, when I replayed that first night in my head, in the slow, merciless light of memory, I thought about how a whisper had been both a literal command and an emblem of things we decide to heed. Run had saved a life and set in motion a life that would be, much later, my own in ways I couldn't imagine that night. They pressed me for details about what I'd seen. Faces, the smell, in the air, the angle the glass had broken. I gave them the small things that mattered. Who had been near the bar? The man with the red scarf who'd spilled his drink when the chandelier fell, the way the kitchen door had slammed open. They took notes the way priests take confessions, precise, dispassionate, and ultimately, a ledger. When Raphael asked me whether I wanted to go home, the question came with the weight of someone offering a truth you might not ask for, to return to a life of small certainties like short shifts and predictable bills, or to step into a corridor that smelled of other people's dangers. Home sounded wonderful and like a lie at once. The city outside was the same city that swallowed secrets by daylight. I had no illusions. Going back to the life I had before would not be a neutral act. "Do you have family?" he asked. "No," I said. "Not anymore." He looked at me like it mattered. "You can go if you want." I nearly laughed. "Go where?" He shrugged. "Anywhere that isn't a place with broken chandelier." He was trying to be light. He failed in the way men who are offered truths. Failures, always a shrug. He wasn't an easy man to read. Not because he hid, but because he had no use for ornate performances. His candor had a practical edge. He talked about leverage and vendors and the economics of a city as if it were a field of chess pieces. But there was a moral kernel in his sentences that kept turning into the same shape. I would rather see this wound stop widening. There was a moment in a kitchen that wasn't mine, in an apartment that smelled like cedar and coffee and other people's lives, when I made a decision that felt like a hinge. A woman can be propelled by grief into revenge, or she can be moved by grief into something that looks like repair. My father's memory did not point me toward blind certainty. He was a man who had chosen to hold consequences with both hands, who had taught me that the law permits tension between mercy and duty. Standing there, I felt like a person offered a different covenant. "Stay the night," I said. "Only the night?" Raphael asked. "At least until the morning," I said. "I need to figure out my next step." That night, I lay awake on a pull-out couch and watched light outline the city's teeth. I tried to replay the whisper to find its origin. It kept folding into my thoughts like a secret too large for my mouth. The apartment hummed around us, Marco, sleeping in a chair, a soft breathing that belonged to Giovanni. Raphael stirring at moments like someone threading through old memories. There was a weight in the air that felt like waiting. In the morning, they offered me choices again. There were options that sounded like they belonged to the chapter called Safety, and others that belonged to Danger. One was to leave the city and adopt a new name in a new place until the commotion died down. Another was to stay under Raphael's protection and be part of whatever plan they devised. They did not hide what either choice would cost. They did not sugarcoat the ledger. "You don't have to choose to be brave," Raphael said quietly, across a table that held only black coffee and two hands. "But if you choose to stay, you'll be in the middle of things." "Your middle," I corrected. "Not mine." He gave a short laugh. "Fair enough. But tonight's whisper, someone pulled a string. I don't like strings left loose." I could have left. I could have taken a train somewhere and erased the sound of a broken chandelier and called my friends and told them I was fine and gone. I had a life that was small and honest and familiar. It would have required me to pretend the world was a pattern of tiles I could sweep clean. I stayed because that whisper had done something to me, a thing that didn't sit well with cowardice. It suggested that someone thought I could be useful. It suggested that I could be more than a server who kept people's steam hot. It suggested that my father's teaching wasn't just a memory, but an instrument. I didn't want to be useful for someone else's war. I wanted to be useful for something that resembled repair, so I stayed. The first days were a study in new rhythms. They gave me a phone whose details I never learned and a map I didn't read. They taught me how to move within the edges of Raphael's world without pretending to belong. Raphael, for his part, kept his distance in the way men who have been burned learn to keep distance, not with coldness, but with a precise respect. He'd sit near the window and watch the street the way a bird watches the ground for movement. Sometimes he would tell me about his family and the gentle, economical stories that get passed down in households built on power. A grandfather who opened a small vineyard and had to learn to navigate violent economies. A sister who married a man who kept ledgers. A mother who taught him the importance of investing in people. His secret, the one that threaded itself into every conversation, was a refusal to accept simple solutions. He did not fetishize force. He did not flatter the idea that a quick kill ends things. He believed in leverage. He believed in using money and influence to make someone fold, to buy time and keep children safe. He had a distrust of retribution for its own sake. I liked that about him because it made him, perversely, less monstrous and more complicated. For all the terrible things a man like him could command, he made a point of not letting violence be the first instrument. It made me uneasy and hopeful at the same time. I had grown up on the credo that the law was a scaffold for fairness. Raphael's creed said fairness sometimes needed a softer, subtler scaffold and a harder hand if pushed. It did not fit neatly into the categories I had been raised to love, but neither did it set my teeth on edge the way people on the news did when they spoke in absolutes. A message arrived on my unmarked phone one afternoon. A picture of a folded newspaper with the headline barely legible and a line of text that read, $50,000 bounty, details pending. It was a leak, a smear, or a threat. It could have been a bluff. It could have been a calculated move meant to unnerve us. Either way, it was a hook. That's a worry, Giovanni said, the word like a shard. Raphael did not flinch. He placed his hands on the table, palms down like a man closing a ledger. They want to make people nervous. They'll test. They will watch our reaction. And they could follow me home, I said. Or they could use you to get to us, Marco said bluntly. You can't have it both ways, I told them. You can't protect me and decide what I do and then be surprised when you're asked to put up collateral. There was a silence. A space where we all considered our places in the ledger. Raphael looked at me with something that was almost approval. You're direct, he said. It's useful. Is that an offer or an observation? I asked. Both, he said. I had been plenty of things in my life, daughter, waitress, someone who could hold a tray without spilling. Suddenly, I was offered a shape I hadn't anticipated. Participant, not a villain, not a trophy, not a bystander. Participant. We did not plan like men on television plan. There were meetings that lasted past midnight where Raphael sat with his advisors and spoke about vendors and property portfolios and the thin lines where power lives. There were men who moved around like chess pieces, Giovanni, Stefano, and others whose names felt like chords, and there were women like Elena who patched wounds with tea and patience. They did not show me how to make things blow up. They showed me how people gather information. They showed me how to listen and when to look away. There was an economy of restraint. They asked for very little from me that would make me feel complicit. You will be part of this, Raphael said at one meeting. He didn't announce it like a decree. It was more like he placed a book in front of me and expected me to read it. If you are willing. I could have said no. I could have left, but I had already seen the city open its mouth and reveal a hazard. The whisper had altered my path. Staying felt for once like a motion I could choose with my whole self. What's the plan? I asked. He smiled, and the smile carried a gentleness that surprised me. To keep you alive, he said simply. And to find out who tried to end me. That's a plan. It's a starting point, he said. All plans begin with a question. There is a peculiar clarity that comes when you decide to be a part of something. Fear recedes into a workable shape, a thing you can measure and then move around. I threw myself into the role like someone learning a new instrument. I watched, I listened, I took notes, like someone giving testimony to herself. The whisper stayed in the background of everything, sometimes as a jolt of memory when a shadow moved wrong, sometimes like a lullaby in the middle of a meeting. I repeated the syllable to myself enough that it became a talisman. Run toward or run away. I wasn't sure it could be command or blessing. It could be prophecy. When I finally agreed to be more than witness, to be a bait, a human magnet to draw out whatever hands had tried to cut. Raphael down to decision felt like stepping off a cliff with a careful calculation about wind. I was terrified. I also felt strangely alive, as if for once I was choosing between two things I cared about rather than letting life decide for me. We'll do this with minimal shock, Raphael said. No theater, no overkill. Minimal shock, I repeated. The phrase was both comforting and terrifying. I had no wish to be paraded into danger for the sake of spectacle, but I also knew that there were degrees of harm, and I had spent my life watching men decide which degrees were acceptable. "It's not a stunt," he said. "It's a way to find the people behind the hands." "You always choose negotiation first?" I asked. He looked at me like he had been waiting to be asked. "Most of the time," he said. "I won't ask someone to die if they can be persuaded to live differently. It keeps you human." "It keeps me human. But there is a line. And if they cross the line, then we deal with consequences," he said. And his voice went quiet enough that the room seemed to lean in. There was no sermon in his words. There was only a ledger of choice, a moral arithmetic that weighed children and businesses and the debt of blood. It felt harsh and honest, like a man who had learned mercy the way you learn a language. Through use, correction, and practice. The night before the plan unfolded, I walked the apartment alone. The city below was a scatter of lights and the occasional noise of a life that paid its own debts and danced with its own ghosts. On the kitchen shelf, Elena had left a cookbook opened, a page with a recipe for slow-braised meat. The margins were full of notes written in a hand that felt like someone's memory of home. The whisper returned, not as a threat now, but as a bell in the dark. Someone, somewhere, had said run to me. Someone had decided I mattered enough to warn. That knowledge kept me tethered to a thread of gratitude and curiosity I could not untangle. I replayed the night in the restaurant and found myself looking back for faces that had not existed before. It felt like being marked by an unseen kindness. When the team gathered in a room with a long table and a single lamp that made everything else recede, Raphael looked at me as if he were about to do something he had done many times and something he had never done at all. "Whatever happens," he said, "we do not let hatred carry us into making everything worse." "Agreed," I said, because I meant it. We set the edges of a plan that was not a manual and not a ritual, only a map with the name of a destination. There was no need for weapons talk aloud. They had their own ways of being prepared that I respected without understanding. There were no instructions I demanded to hear. I wanted to be a part of the moral architecture of the thing, not its construction crew. When the day arrived for me to be at a small gallery opening chosen because it was public and because it offered a certain crowd, Pat and I, dressed in a black dress that would not call attention in the wrong way, but was meant to look like somebody who belonged at a place where people paid to feel smaller. Raphael walked a few steps behind me as if he were a private constellation. Giovanni and Stefano blended into the throng like shadows that had opinions. The whisper had been with me through the whole process, a soft repetition in my mind, a cue. I thought of it then as a kind of guardian angel, or a loose thread I might follow, to find out who had given me the warning in the first place. It felt ridiculous to think of angels in an apartment with a man like Raphael. Yet the city keeps its secrets in the strangest forms. We moved through the gallery. People smiled the etiquette of strangers, their faces polished and diplomatic. I drifted, listened, exchanged small talk like currency. At some point, as Raphael moved through a group of investors, someone collided with me accidental, practiced, clumsy. My notes said nothing. My instinct said look for a hand that lingers too long or a sleeve that presses the wrong way. The room hummed in its polished manner. I kept thinking about my father's hands and the things they had taught me. Watch for the shift, the twitch, the hesitation. My life had become a study in hesitation and decision. When the whisper first landed on my neck, I had thought of it as a signal I would obey and then forget. It had not occurred to me that obeying could become an invitation. It had not occurred to me that a single syllable, said almost tenderly, could rearrange my life into a place where I would be asked to stand for something bigger than a wage. It had not occurred to me that a mafia boss's secret code could look like a human concern. As the evening wound on and I performed the small art of being unremarkable, I held the whisper like a stone in my pocket. It warmed against my hand with the promise and threat of a future I had not yet earned. It was a single, simple word, and it had already changed everything. I moved through the gallery like a shadow learning its edges. People smiled in the practiced way people do when money lubricates conversation. Paintings leaned like quiet hosts. The whisper sat in my pocket the way a coin sits, warm and ready. I kept thinking of my father's hands, how he had taught me to read the world in small movements, and I kept watching hands. Every conversation became a map of wrists and sleeves and the way someone concealed or revealed the knife of a habit. I had agreed to be bait, to be the human center that would pull the teeth from whatever beast had tried to bite Raphael. That agreement sat in my chest like a new organ. Necessary, alarming, alive. If you like tense, character-led thrillers, subscribe for more. It wasn't a stunt. It was arithmetic with human faces. I drifted toward a corner where the light softened and pretended to admire a canvas that looked like a memory of a storm. Raphael was a few paces behind me, present in the way a lighthouse is present, invulnerable, steady. Giovanni and Stefano breathed like shadows along the gallery's edges. I felt their presence like a pressure in the room, the comfort of straps on a life vest. A man brushed my arm politely, too politely, the kind of contact that asks to be mistaken for accident. My wrist cooled where his fingertips had passed. A practiced hand catches the heat in a body, and the training my father had given me translated a muscle memory into questions. I turned. The man smiled with the ease of someone who'd practiced such expressions half his life. He stepped back, apologetic, and we both laughed, the civil laugh people use to end small collisions. Then there was a sound, like a throat clearing in cloth. A subtle shift as if the gallery itself shifted its attention. A small explosion, somewhere near the service corridor, blew out the plan of the room. Paintings trembled. A lamp shattered. Rain of glass, like a confession. People screamed, ran. The polite hum of fine conversation dissolved into an animal sound. Everything condensed to a handful of moments I could name. I smelled the burnt sweetness of something that shouldn't be in a gallery. I saw Marco move with the economy of someone who did what he did without hesitance. Raphael's jaw clenched. Giovanni's hand landed on my elbow and guided me away from the broken lamp with a force that felt like a behind-the-scenes promise. We will not let you be the one the world remembers. We ducked behind a sculpture of a woman with her face turned away. Someone tripped over a chair. A man with a briefcase bolted for the exit. My training told me to count. My father had taught me counting in moments of crisis. Numbers anchor a mind. But the gallery's chaos was not clean enough for numbers to matter. The attackers were professionals who had lost the precision of the plan and replaced it with chaos when they were discovered. That mistake could cost them control. It also meant they were scrambling. A figure lashed out at Raphael from the other side of an overturned display. Giovanni intercepted with a weight that was the size of everything he'd learned to hold back. The scuffle was quick, animal, a close fight with hands and the commerce of elbows. I saw a gun come free from a holster like a cursed thing and then be wrestled away. There was no elegant choreography, only the frantic urgency of people trying to get the upper hand. When it ended, two men in their 30s were on the floor, breathing hard, held by Giovanni and Stefano. One was bleeding from the temple in a way that made me hold my breath, and not for spectacle, but for the specific dread of a life I've known to be small and precious. The sound of sirens finally threaded into the scene, the city's official response to things that didn't belong in galleries. We had them alive. It felt both like victory and like the opening of a deeper door. Alive meant interrogation, and interrogation meant stories. Stories meant paper trails and people who had contracts and financiers who liked being invisible. A body thrown into the river solves an immediate problem but buries questions. A captured man can be asked who paid him, who arranged logistics, and names are keys. Back at the penthouse, the men sat in a room that smelled of clean linen and old coffee. Giovanni set cups down, as if he were a man constructing ritual. I sat and watched because part of me had become someone who stayed and listened. Raphael did not shout. He might have had the reason, the power, and the fury to make someone disappear, but he preferred questions to retribution. That was his secret, a preference for leverage and the economy of leverage. He operated like an investor in human outcomes, calculating the loss and the gain, measuring collateral like a man who'd learned the cost of blood. Who hired you? Giovanni asked simply. The smaller of the two men spat out curses in a language that wasn't kind to us, but was easily translated. The bigger of them answered eventually with a reluctant list of names. It was not the whole chain. Mercenaries don't know the people who signed the checks, but it was enough. They had been hired by a contact that matched a pattern we had seen in other cities. Money passed through shell companies, A mid-level fixer, in a business that sold logistics, and a name whispered in envelopes. Dmitry Klov, the name Raphael had already given me, appeared again, not necessarily as the hand that fired a bullet, but as the producer behind the curtain. Behind Dmitry were financiers who behaved like ghosts, portfolios, and offshore accounts. Businesses that existed on paper and breathed money into violent ventures. The men were brought into a narrower room across from Raphael, who listened while someone else described the chain, paper to paper. When the men admitted their employer, they did it with the old, quiet arrogance of paid labor. They had been hired and they had done what they were told. They had been promised money. Money makes people speak the language of travel and quiet houses. Money is a poor god, but it pays attention. When Raphael asked what they'd been told about me, whether they had a target list, whether they had been meant to kill indiscriminately, the bigger man shrugged. We were told only that there was a problem, he said. A name, an address, a price. And the price? Giovanni asked. The man looked at him as if the question had already warmed his hand. Enough, he said. Enough to make us forget there's a life attached. I thought of my father's voice then, how he had said that a badge doesn't make you less human. My father had once told me to remember what it meant to hold two truths, that someone could be dangerous, and that danger could come from being desperate. The captured men were both. They had hands that had done terrible things and hands that had been following the logic of someone else. There was no simple map from grievance to action. Raphael's face folded into something like sorrow as the men spoke. He did not celebrate their capture with the sort of vindictive joy I had seen in other men of his station. He listened as if he were cataloging damage that would need repairing. At one point, he stood and walked to the window and stared at the city as if it were a ledger that had been written in a language he was still learning to read. We'll find who funded them, he said at the end, voice low, and we'll make them stop. We could take them out, Marco said matter-of-factly, and the room filled with the bluntness of the suggestion. Raphael didn't look at him with anger. He only said, killing the men who were paid will not find the man who hired them. It will not stop anyone who learns a lesson from those bodies. There was a cost to not killing, there always is. A captured man can be a target for rescue by his employers. He can be a loose end that invites attention. Raphael knew the trade-off. He paid a price for his preference for negotiation. More time, more risk, more nights like that one. But he had learned a principle that named its own danger. Killing is easy. Leverage is harder. They scoured bank statements, leaned on relationships in ways that were legal enough to be a nuisance and formless enough to be intimate. They called in favors and made veiled offers to investors who didn't want to see their business models disassembled in public. The people who pulled strings in the city preferred tidy books and respectable boardrooms. When a boardroom becomes messy with the smell of blood, whose suit wants the stain? Raphael made the assumption that most didn't. He leveraged that assumption into pressure. We learned that Dmitry had been pinked in the city's peripheries, building permits stalled, shipments rerouted, property deals evaporating under roots of rumor. Raphael's people didn't burn bridges. They tightened the screws around those who prefer the quiet of plausible deniability. He made moves within legitimate channels, buyers for Dmitry's supply lines, offers on properties he needed to shield movement, whispers in the right ears to spark audits and headlines. There was a perverse artistry to it. Where force destroys, leverage rearranges the world to make the aggressor feel instability in the thing he thought secure. Dmitry, the rumor went, liked his power to feel inevitable. Power is endangered when the ground under it shifts unpredictably. Raphael had discovered routes to make the ground shift, not with explosions or carnage, but with the slow erosion of the kind of wealth that underwrites a man's reach. "You're doing this with money?" I asked once, when he explained in a way that didn't reveal tradecraft, but did reveal intent. "You buy people out of the game?" He smiled. "Money is a language, Lucia. It buys choices. Sometimes it buys silence. Sometimes it buys relocation. Sometimes it buys a ledger without a name. And isn't that just shifting the violence?" I pressed. "Not ending it." He took my hand, then not clutched. Not to possess, but to connect, like an acknowledgement. "It is not ending it," he said, "but it is directing it. We choose which things to break and which to mend. Violence begets violence. Leverage can break cycles without creating new graves. I wanted to call the police. I wanted to trust the blue line as my father had taught me to trust it. Yet the police are a different instrument, often slow to react, subject to public scrutiny and legal bind. Raphael's operations moved in those folds where law and money intersected. He chose the space where a lawsuit can be as painful as a bullet and where a lost contract can be as dangerous as a threat. He chose a way that minimized that became his secret laid bare. He was capable of brutality, but he preferred economy. As the months moved, so did my life. I was no longer a woman who carried dishes and collected tips. I was a woman who could play a role both quiet and loud, who could meet people and gather information without being conspicuous. I wore my apron less often and owned more of my sentences. Raphael watched that change with an attention that smelled like care. It was not possessive. It was something like admiration tied to a fierce gratitude. He had watched me move in a crisis and had seen competence bloom from a place that had never been asked to be anything but serviceable. That had power. We ate together in the small hours sometimes, winter neighbor to winter neighbor, sharing coffee until the city softened into morning. Raphael was not a man given to sentimental speech, but in the quiet of those small dinners, he let me hear his past. He told me about his grandfather and the vineyard that had been built on negotiation and threat in equal measures. He told me about his mother and the way she had taught him to invest in people because investments could create dependencies that carried care forward. He told me, without flinching, about the ledger's stains and how some marks never wash out. It was not confessional as much as it was an offering of facts. I listened because I had a kind of hunger for the story of why he chose what he chose. And the more I watched him choose, the more I understood the thing that had made him different. He had the capacity to order a life right and the restraint not to treat every insult as an occasion. His code did not sanctify him. It complicated him. He knew that his power could be weaponized, and he tried to make sure whenever he exercised it that it repaired something rather than merely avenged it. It was not noble. It was pragmatic. It was, in his terms, a way to be whole without pretending you were without sin. Love, when it came, didn't have the cinematic sweep I had imagined as a teenager. It arrived in crowded subway cars and in a hand that found mine when a painting trembled and in a small argument over whether sugar and coffee ruined a morning. It was the slow accretion of ordinary moments. A text in the middle of the day asking if I had eaten. A jacket draped over my shoulders on nights when the city bit sharp. It was Raphael's patience when I took the long route from suspicion to trust. He didn't demand gratitude. He offered steadiness and a surprising kind of tenderness that did not look like conquest. One night on the roof of his building, with the city as a scatter of light and the air cold enough to make breath visible, I said something I had thought 100 times and never voiced. "Are you afraid?" I asked. He turned, his face lined in the rooftop's glow. "Of what?" "Of becoming what people expect you to be," I said. "Of being the monster the papers write about." He looked at me then in a way that felt like a hand reaching for an answer he couldn't quite hold. "Of losing myself," he admitted. "Of waking up and finding that the ledger has swallowed me whole. I fear the day when my choices become automatic, when kindness is only the sound I make to keep business moving. I fear becoming someone who cannot look at his children and know he did enough." I thought of James Hart then, and the way my father had measured his life not by trophies or headlines but by the lives he had steadied. Raphael feared the same kind of failure. His secret, the moral architecture that valued leverage over blood, wasn't a cover for goodness so much as a strategy to be alive and to keep alive those he cared about. He proposed in a way that fit him, not with a dramatic knee in the marble of a restaurant, but with a small, thought-out moment. We had been in a modest Brooklyn bistro, no chandeliers, no gold nets, just plates that smelled of garlic and red sauce, and a waiter who knew only to nod. Raphael's mother had given him a ring years before, a simple band with a chip of lapis set into its center. He had carried it like a token, an odd heirloom that suited a man of ledgers and vineyards. When he slipped it on my finger, there were no cameras and no headline. It fit like a sentence made to sit in the mouth. "I am not asking you to forgive what I am," he said. "I am asking you to permit me to be better with you." I said yes because by then better wasn't a promise of We married in a small ceremony family, and friends of various sorts, none of them perfect, all of them real. My father's absence was a hollow that opened and closed like a tide. Raphael stood with a steadiness that felt like a promise. He took my name in the private way. He had learned to claim things with reverence and an economy that did not insist on spectacle. Pregnancy arrived in the ordinary way of most large, important things, gradually and then with a sudden clarity. I remember the ultrasound, like a flash photograph of a life. Raphael squeezed my hand until I thought he might break the bones of it. We named her Isabella Maria Bellori in a small, fierce meeting in a hospital room. Maria, for Raphael's mother. Isabella for the fierce women in my lineage who had held against the city's tide. The name felt right, in the mouth and insistence of two families braided by choice. There were hard days. Being married to a man with power means you're complicit to a degree you cannot entirely escape. There were nights I replayed choices and wondered if staying had been a foolishness that traded one kind of security for moral slippage. There were times I wanted to pick up a badge and march into a precinct and demand simple answers. Raphael never asked me to stop asking those questions. He tolerated them and sometimes answered them clumsily but honestly. He admitted his fear of becoming the ledger. I admitted mine of being quiet on the things I believed mattered. The conflict with Dmitri escalated like a pressure rising in a closed system. He flailed in ways that were more public now that Raphael's maneuvers made his own life precarious. There were legal investigations whispered into newspapers, business partners pulling away, suppliers calling him names that made him sound less invincible. Dmitri sent men to pry at the places where his life still had seams. A dock operation upstate, a shell corporation in the city, a warehouse that had always felt too purpose-built to be honest. Raphael did not claim victory without cost. The cost came in the form of late nights, in men who watched over property, and in the occasional melee where decisions had to be made fast. At the docks, a confrontation we had all hoped would be turned ugly in the way urgent things do. Dmitri's crew had blocked a shipment. It was a symbolic move more than a strategic one. Raphael sent men to open a line of negotiation. The line failed. Violent, small, swift, lacking in justification. It was controlled, in the sense that those responding had a purpose other than bloodlust. But there was force, and there were men who had been hurt. Raphael watched it, all his hands clasped, jaw tense. Afterwards he walked through the place where the scuffle had occurred and looked at the men as if each one were a ledger entry that needed to be made right. You kept to the line, I said later. When we sat in the kitchen of our small house, a home that smelled of simmered sauce and something like peace. I tried, he said, but there are always costs. I cannot promise there will be no blood in the margins. Is it worth it? I asked. He looked at me for a long time. You tell me, he said, and it was my job as his partner to answer. Is it worth protecting what we have without letting vengeance become the first reaction? I told him then what my father had told me once. The job of those with power is to ensure that power does not calcify into a rule that only the powerful live by. We talked about structures, about how to make a city where children could play without fear, where a person's birth did not determine their fate. It felt grand and naive in the same sentence. It also felt like a map for the small things we could do. The James Hart Community Center was born out of that map. Raphael could have made a donation and counted it a victory. Instead, he took a risk on legitimacy, in a public way that made him vulnerable. He bought a neglected building in a neighborhood where my father had walked his beat, where kids kicked cans in the street, and where the police chief had known my father's face. He didn't make it a facade. He invested in programming, after-school tutoring, trades classes, scholarships, and in people who had the trust of the community. He put money behind the words he liked to use in private, opportunity, investment, repair. The center's opening was a chaotic, beautiful thing. Kids lined up to see books placed on new shelves. The mayor gave a speech that was sweet and bureaucratic, and I watched Raphael stand like someone who had deposited himself into the public light and was willing, for once, to be judged there. There were murmurs in the press about his motives. There were skeptics who claimed he used philanthropy as a smear shield. There were also families who came in with tearful gratitude. People who would not have had a summer job without the center's placement program. The truth was never clean. The center didn't absolve him of everything he'd been, nor did it fix every problem. It did something else. It made a public investment that tied his name to a community that would hold him accountable for how he used influence. On the day we cut the ribbon, I thought of James Hart and his quiet way of measuring impact. The center was named after my father in a private decision Raphael made without much fanfare but with a fierce intent. He told me once that he had chosen the name because my father had given him a favor once long ago, something simple and human that had cost my father. Raphael didn't talk about it much. He preferred to make restitution silently. It was the kind of history that had a public and a private face. Isabella was born in a small hospital room that smelled like bleach and coffee and newness. I remembered the second I saw her how small she was and how enormous the love in my chest felt on Raphael's face as he folded around her. A man for once, without the ledger in his eyes, only wonder. He cried like a person who had carried an unspoken burden and finally set it down for a moment. There was a softness in him I hadn't seen before, a vulnerability that wasn't weakness, but rather a presence that acknowledged the fragility of life. We argued once, in the thick of new parenthood, about how much to shield our daughter from the part of his life that had always been present. "You can't keep her hope naive," I told him. "She has to know the world is rough, but you can't fill her world with the things that will scar her before she knows how to read a book." He nodded, exhausted. "I want her to have a future where she can choose how to walk with power or without it. And if that future demands we keep making bargains?" I asked. "Then we will keep making them carefully," he said. "We will not pretend to be saints." The compromises of our life existed in the quiet spaces between breakfasts and late-night strategy sessions. Raphael remained a man with access to dangerous tools. He never pretended otherwise. What changed was the way he chose to use them, price and influence before bullets, whenever it served the end of protecting innocence. The choices were always gray, and sometimes the gray felt unforgivable. There were nights of furious conversation where I demanded to know how many people had been hurt in the name of leverage. He answered with silence, or with the reluctant detail of someone who has seen the calculus play out and cannot unsee the ledger stains. There was a final negotiation that felt like the closing of a book. Dmitri, pressed by the slow unraveling of his finances, his partners abandoning him, and the attention of the authorities, sent an emissary to a private restaurant where Raphael chose to meet him. The place was unremarkable, a room of dark wood and quiet corners, meant for private commerce. Dmitri did not come. He sent a man who looked like someone who had been taught to be a negotiator by the school of threats. We sat at opposite tables, a slow meal that tasted like diplomacy. Raphael did not roar. He offered terms, territory boundaries that would preserve life and business, but would constrain Dmitri's expansion. Financial arrangements that forced Dmitri's funders to reconsider the moral hazard of supporting a man whose business models attracted violence. And an agreement that would require Dmitri to withdraw from certain lines of commerce. It was not a surrender speech. It was a set of hard limits, backed by a quiet threat. Comply or continue to watch your life unravel through nonviolent means that would cost you your leverage. "I could force you," Raphael said at one point, voice low. "And I could do worse," the emissary said, which was the old script of threats disguised as negotiation. "You already do worse," Raphael replied. "You create chaos and then complain when the world reacts. I can make your life boring. I can make it so the things that made you feel powerful, the shipments, the properties, the partnerships, become liabilities." It was mercantile cruelty, not theatrical cruelty. It was a way of making violence irrelevant by making profitability fragile. The emissary left with a list, a document, a set of terms to deliver. The next week, Dmitri's people began to fold like cards in a wind he did not control. There were no dramatic midnight executions, no movie-style There were resignations in sales and lawyers. A few men who had been instrumental in Dmitri's operations were arrested for crimes that predated the feud. Some fled. The city breathed easier because the public violence lessened. That did not mean the problem was solved. It meant that one corridor of violence had been closed. Other corridors remain in every city. Raphael's code had halted one particular spiral of blood into a more human fabric. There was always a cost. Men had been hurt, businesses faltered, and men I had met in the earlier days, faces I had seen on the floor of a gallery, had wounds that would take time to heal. Raphael had to live with what his decisions did to people. He could not wash his hands of it. He had not wanted to. The secret that had made him different, his preference for leverage, required more patience, more accountability, and a steadier stomach than brute force would have. He paid for that restraint. It cost him nights of sleep and an internal reckoning with the ways he'd been compromised. Time makes soft things of even hard edges. The city adjusted. The center hummed. Isabella learned to say, "Mama and Papa," and the sound of those words braided us into a small family unit that had once felt inconceivable. Raphael owned businesses that were now legitimate in public and still complicated at their core. He brought people in who could translate the work of influence into legitimate enterprise, philanthropic boards, community leaders, investors who liked the idea of social good tied to profit. On the 10-year anniversary of the Bellanova incident, the night chandelier had shattered and a whisper had run down my neck. Raphael and I walked through a small, newly renovated park near the community center. Children chased a soccer ball. An older woman from the neighborhood stopped and kissed Isabella on the forehead like a blessing. I thought about the whisper then. How a hiss of 2 syllables had rearranged my life. It had been a literal command the night of the restaurant and a figurative one ever since. Run toward or run away. I had chosen to run. I thought also about Raphael's secret, that he had built his power on a ledger and that he used it to keep people alive rather than merely to feed his vanity. That secret wasn't an absolution. It was a moral posture that recognized the cost of staying inside the ledger and the cost of stepping outside. He still did things I could not endorse fully. He still had the capacity for violence that he could wield when he believed the line had been crossed. The difference was, he considered the arithmetic first. At the community center's 10th anniversary, a plaque hung on the wall with my father's name. Raphael had organized a small ceremony where people who had profited from the center's programs told their stories. There were kids who had grown up and now taught younger ones to read. There were tradespeople who had learned a skill and then opened a shop on the block. The center did not solve structural inequality. It did not pretend to. It was a small machine for inserting possibility into a place where possibility had been scarce. I stood at the edge of the event and watched Raphael talk with a man who ran a job training program. The two of them animated over a syllabus. Raphael's hands moved the way my father's used to when he explained something that mattered. The sight of it made my chest ache with a complicated tenderness. He had become a man willing to put his money where his choices were, a man trying, despite everything, to make a city that could cradle a child like ours. One night, years later, I asked him if he'd ever regretted the path that led him into darkness. He thought, for a long time. Regret implies a desire to return, he said finally. I can't return to who I was and be useful to anyone. I can only look at what I did and try to make amends. Amends are never complete. They are gestures, commitments, a steady turning toward repair. Raphael made those gestures in public and in private. He funded scholarships. He protected neighborhoods from predatory developers in ways that were ugly and beautiful at the same time. He used his influence to support reforms in zoning and to encourage businesses to hire locally. He did not erase the past. He acknowledged it. He paid the price of recognition. When Isabella was old enough to walk into the community center by herself and find a table where her art could be displayed, she pinned a small drawing of a house on the center's bulletin board. It was a crooked house, with smoke curling from the chimney and a person in the window. She had no idea of the meetings and arguments and the ledger pages that had financed that building. She only knew that the center was a place where kids like her could find glue sticks and mentors who believed they could be something else. That simple faith felt like a miracle to me, a kind of redemption that was neither full nor empty. As life softened, the whisper remained a motif rather than a command. I said the word to myself, sometimes not to relive fear, but to remember the smallness of the moment that had altered everything. A single word had cut the fabric of my routine and given me a different life. A life in which I had been asked to carry more and, in carrying it, had learned how to bear complexity. I had moved from being a woman who served to a woman who chose. That change did not make my father's lessons irrelevant. It deepened them. Raphael's secretist choice to use leverage and negotiation ahead of bloodshed was not a salvation. Plenty would say it was merely a rationalization for a man with power. They might be right, but I had seen it spare lives. I had seen him choose an economy of repair over spectacle. I had seen him stand at the hospital when a man he had once ordered moved to safety returned packs of apologies in the form of a letter. I had seen him weep quietly when a choice he'd made still carved harm in the lives of ordinary people. There was contrition there. Not theatrical, but practical. There were moments when the ledger demanded things I could not stomach. There were times I wanted to pull the cord and remove us both from the equation entirely. Raphael understood that. He did not ask me to erase my father's creed. He asked me to be his partner in making choices, hard ones, that sometimes cost us sleep, sometimes cost us reputation, sometimes cost us the small comforts of moral simplicity. When Isabella took my hand the first time, she asked, "Mama, why did someone tell you to run?" I told her the truth, in terms she could hold. I said, "Because sometimes people see danger before we do. Because sometimes a kind voice can change a life." She considered this with the earnestness of small children. "Did it change everything?" she asked. I looked at Raphael, who was in the doorway watching us, like someone who kept his treasures in plain sight. "Yes," I said. "It changed everything." He smiled then, the kind of smile that had nothing to hide and everything to offer. "And it made some things better," he added, "because he knew the world in increments, not absolutes. We had built a life that was not perfect. It was threaded with compromise and the knowledge that power can be a poison or a cure, depending on how it's used. Raphael's secret was that he had tried, imperfectly, to use it like an incubator rather than a hammer. For all that had been ugly in his past, he had chosen a ledger that often, though not always, tilted toward repair. The city kept on. New problems arrived like seasons, indifferent to our personal victories. We faced them as a family, an odd union of a cop's daughter and a man made of ledgers. Sometimes the moral calculus felt unbearable. Sometimes it felt necessary. The truth is messy. You can love someone and hate what they have done. You can accept help and know the hand is stained. You can build a center name for a man you miss and hope that future children will have better maps. On balance, the whisper that night at Bellanova had been a pivot I could not have predicted. I had obeyed it without knowing why. It had finally led me to a man who, for all his faults, tried to keep the body count low and the options open. It had led to a child who ran barefoot in our park and to a community center where a woman learned to read. Those were real things, imperfect and stubborn. My father's voice lived in me, quiet, precise, the kind that taught me to watch hands. Raphael's secret lived in him, the ledger, the preference for leverage, the constant self. Our lives braided those two doctrines, law and ledger, badge and balance sheet. Together we tried to make choices that held the possibility of repair rather than the inevitability of revenge. On some evenings, when the city lay smoothed under the night, and Isabella slept in a room filled with drawings taped like flags, Raphael and I would sit at the window and talk about possibilities. We did not imagine a fully redeemed past. We imagined a present that could offer someone a different path. We imagined a future where a whisper could still be life-saving and where a man's secret might be used to protect neighborhoods, not intimidate them. Those imaginings were fragile and stubborn, like seedlings in winter. I had been invisible in a room of people who paid to be seen. A whisper had moved inside me and redirected my life. The man who had received that whispered, the one who had once sat alone at table 7, had a secret that complicated him and, in its complexity, made him in some ways quieter, more dangerous to his enemies, but also more likely to keep children safe. It was not a fairy tale where a single act leads to redemption. It was a lived argument about what one does with power when the world offers so many easier solutions. If you felt the tension of decisions that split between harm and repair, if you find yourself wondering what you would do in Lucia's place, tell me below. Like if the whisper unsettled you, comment with the moral dilemma that stays with you, and subscribe for the next story.